Okay, so this video is going to be over how I introduce quadratics to my students. Now, when we start with quadratics, what I generally actually do is I will start with the linears and the absolute values. We'll do reviews of those and look at, again, the patterns as to what's happening. And then when I'm doing the absolute values, I will say, okay, well, what happens if we change, instead of having the absolute value of x, what happens if we put a square there? And then they'll see, and most kids know what a parabola looks like. So they'll say, oh, it changed it to a parabola. And so then once we realize that the graph of a quadratic is a parabola, then I do have them start taking and going through the exact same steps that we did earlier. And we're going to take this and we are going to start with adding 1 to it. And so we talk about, does it have the same pattern? Does it do the same thing that happened when we did it with our line and translated our line, translated our absolute value and so forth? And they'll say, yeah, it's just going to move it up. Okay? And then we talk about, okay, well then if that's the case, what's it going to do if it's a negative? The other thing that we talk about, both when it is, let me go back here real quick, because both when we're here in this positive, we talk about, okay, not only are we talking about the fact that it moved it up to, we start talking about, okay, well, what's the vertex? And we start naming that. Okay, the vertex is 0, 2. And at this point, I don't put it in the graph itself so far because I'm just talking about the up and down movements a little bit, but we do talk about it. The other thing we talk about is, okay, that 0, 2 becomes your y-intercept. Okay, that makes sense to them. And then I ask them, okay, but we don't have any x-intercepts. Does that make sense to our equation? And so most of them can say, okay, well, we would let y be 0, and when we move that 2 over, then we're going to get a negative, which means when I square root it, we're going to get imaginary numbers. And so, yes, that should make sense that we're not going to have any y-intercepts or x-intercepts. Also, when I am teaching the solving of square roots, the solving of quadratics, that we talk about, the imaginary numbers, and then I throw in, what we're looking at here is in terms of graphing our x-intercepts, and so when we get that imaginary number, we don't have any x-intercepts. So they've already been told that when solving, so we're just reiterating it here. So then when we go down and we do the -1, it's okay, well, now look at that one. That one has x-intercepts. Does that make sense to your equation? So if we put a 0 in for y, now when I move my 1 over, I would have, in fact, a positive number that I'm taking the square root of. And so, again, when we're doing this, we're just kind of reiterating all of these different things to them as we're doing it. And then we just continue on. Okay? So once we've done the movement of the up and the down, then, of course, we go back in and we're going to look at the right and the left movement. And I do start off with just putting in the -1. And we talk about, okay, so -1 just moved it to the right. And that kind of starts throwing them again. But we talk about, and I have to kind of reiterate, okay, remember, though, when we had the point slope form, it was y minus y, or slope form, y minus y, because it's the change in all the time. So really what we've entered here is a +1. And so at this point, sometimes I do go ahead and say, okay, so because of it being a minus already, if we did the -1 or -2, now that's going to move it left, because now I've entered a negative. And then I do also show them as we're doing this, I'll go ahead and put it in straight as a plus and say, hey, look, it's the same thing, and I can even close the, oops, I didn't mean to do that. I can even, what I meant to do was turn it off and on. Let me get this back up here. So what I meant by that was we can turn this off, and I haven't changed it. Turn it off, turn it on, turn it on. See, it's the same thing. And so we look at the fact that those two things mean the same thing. They should know that already, yes. But, you know, you're going to have some that this struggles. They look at that and they say a 2. You know, it's going to move it right 2. You know, but just reiterating that it is the change in. So once we've talked about the right and left, and quadratics don't seem to take near as long as, you know, the others because you've already got your pattern going. And then, of course, we do go in and start doing our the change in the steepness of our quadratic. So what happens if it's a 2, 3? And again, we do talk about the fact that, you know, and they'll say it changes the slope. And then I do go in and reiterate that, you know, when we talk about quadratics, you know, we don't really use that word slope as much, because slope, when we think of it with linears, it's consistent, a constant slope. And so we do talk about the fact that now it's no longer a constant slope. And I do have them go in and find the slope as you go up. Not necessarily right now, but as we go through, looking at the fact that it is not a constant slope. Anyway, so we go on up with that, and then we start talking about, okay, so from what we know with lines, if this becomes a fraction, what's it going to do? You know, and so forth. And they're, like I said, at this point, they're pretty good at picking it up. And so then when I say, okay, what's going to happen if it is a negative, they can usually jump in and tell me before we ever hit the button what's going to happen. Okay? And then, of course, then I do the predictions. And this is kind of my favorite part, and theirs, I think, because then they start, as I say, feeling smart. I shouldn't say it that way, but they do. They feel like, oh, you know, it's all come together. I know these answers. And so I put it all in, and I'll say, okay, now tell me what happens. And I write it, usually I will write it in there and close it up, or I will have them do the prediction, and then we'll light it up and see if we're right. And then we'll do, you know, 4 or 5 of those and talk about. And then again, you can go ahead and reinforce and have them solve it for your x-intercepts and y-intercepts and say, okay, so if we're finding the x-intercepts, let's go ahead and put a 0 here. And let's just go ahead and solve it, because this says we're not going to have any x-intercepts. Let's try it. Let's see what we get, and so forth. Okay, so that is introducing quadratics. And of course, I always introduce everything in Vertex form. And then we go more into standard form when we're talking about, we've done factoring, and then we come back here and we look at our factored form and we look at it on the graph again.